The air buzzed with excitement as the employees of Meraki Innovations, a local tech company, gathered in the parking lot of the old Lakeside Inn. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the promise of a relaxing weekend at the Lakeside Cottage put everyone in a lively mood. After a long year of hard work and countless late nights, this was the perfect opportunity to unwind, bond, and finally take a break from the usual hustle. It felt almost surreal. Laughter echoed, and stories were shared as each person tossed their bags into the company shuttle, ready for the 2-hour drive to the cottage. Nestled deep in the woods, the cottage was a charming yet grand structure, with wooden beams and large windows overlooking the calm, still lake. It had been in the community for generations and was known for its rustic charm and peaceful ambience. Few locals knew the stories behind its thick walls. Even fewer ever questioned its history. For the Meraki team, it was simply a picturesque getaway. For Laura, the trip felt like a fresh start. She was the company's HR manager, a confidant to many employees, and always quick to lend a helping hand. She was also one of the few people who knew the story behind the upcoming weekend. There was tension in the air, a subtle but present friction between the CEO, Henry, and one of the newest hires, Alex. Henry, known for his charisma and confidence, had a way of leading with a firm yet friendly hand. He was admired by most, but also carried an aura of mystery that Laura had often observed with a mix of fascination and caution. The employees were excited to be away from their desks, and Henry was especially charming that day, making rounds and greeting everyone, his broad smile welcoming and seemingly genuine. Yet, Laura noticed something odd. He seemed overly attentive to Alex. Alex, a young and talented coder, had joined Meraki just 6 months ago. She was bright, ambitious, and driven. The more Laura observed, the clearer it became that Alex appeared uncomfortable whenever Henry was around, avoiding his gaze and shying away from his attention. Laura had thought it might just be her imagination, but the more she saw, the more it unsettled her. As the team unpacked and settled into the cozy cottage, laughter filled the air. The group split off to explore the area, kayak on the lake, and unwind in the open air. Laura found herself gazing out over the lake, lost in thought. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she was missing, some undercurrent she didn't quite understand. After a few hours, the group gathered around a bonfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, the warmth of the flames casting a glow on their faces as night fell. Henry was in his element, leading the group with his confident energy and charming smile, as if he were as much a friend as he was a boss. But when his gaze found Alex across the fire, Laura noticed something in his eyes. A possessive gleam, a flicker of something she hadn't noticed before. Henry made his way over to Alex, who looked visibly uncomfortable as he struck up a conversation. Laura strained to hear but couldn't make out the words. From her distance, however, she could see Alex's tense body language and her attempt to politely excuse herself from the conversation. When everyone retired to their rooms for the night, Laura felt uneasy. She had always trusted Henry as her boss, but seeing Alex's discomfort had stirred something in her. As the hours ticked by, Laura lay awake, listening to the sounds of the cottage settling. Then, in the quiet of the night, she heard voices. Soft, yet distinct. A man and a woman, their words muffled but filled with tension. Laura recognized Henry's voice. She couldn't catch what was being said, but something about the tone felt wrong. She considered going back to bed, but her curiosity got the better of her. Quietly, she made her way to the end of the hall, where the voices were coming from. She peeked around the corner and saw Henry and Alex standing close together, too close. Alex's expression was a mixture of frustration and fear, while Henry seemed insistent, his voice a low murmur she could barely make out. "Henry, please." Alex's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. "I've already told you." She stopped short as he took a step closer, cutting her off. Laura's heart pounded as she debated what to do. She wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding, that Henry couldn't possibly be making her uncomfortable intentionally. Yet everything in Alex's expression spoke of a deeper truth, a discomfort that couldn't be misread. She debated stepping in, but as she took a step forward, she heard footsteps approaching from behind. She quickly backed away and returned to her room, unsettled by what she had just witnessed. The next day, Laura tried to shake off the memory, but it lingered. She noticed how Alex kept her distance from Henry, how she seemed withdrawn compared to the others who were relaxed and laughing. The rest of the group noticed Alex's silence as well, though most shrugged it off as her being tired or simply introverted. Laura couldn't help but wonder if something had happened between Henry and Alex before the retreat, something that left her wary of his intentions. A storm had been brewing since morning, and by evening, it broke loose in full force. Thunder echoed through the trees, and lightning illuminated the lake. The storm brought an eerie atmosphere to the cottage, a stark contrast to the earlier warmth and laughter. Later that night, just as Laura was starting to feel at ease, the power went out, plunging the cottage into darkness. The group huddled in the living room, waiting for the generator to kick in. With only flashlights and candles to light the room, the atmosphere felt tense and uneasy. Laura noticed Henry trying to pull Alex aside, his voice barely a murmur as he tried to engage her in conversation. Alex's face was pale, her eyes wide with discomfort. Before Laura could step in, Sarah, one of the more outspoken employees, finally spoke up. "Hey, Henry, why don't you give Alex a break? We're all here to relax, remember?" Sarah's tone was light but firm. Henry laughed it off, but Laura could see his frustration simmering beneath the surface. The tension in the room was palpable, and Laura felt the weight of something heavy pressing down on her chest. She knew something was wrong, but confronting Henry was a risk she wasn't sure she was ready to take. As the storm raged outside, Laura's thoughts raced. She couldn't shake the feeling that this trip, meant to bring everyone closer, was instead pulling them apart. She couldn't help but feel that the truth was waiting, hidden in plain sight, like a storm on the verge of breaking. The next morning dawned gray and foggy, the storm clouds lingering over the lake like a heavy veil. The night's tension clung to the air, and as the team gathered for breakfast, the atmosphere was markedly subdued. Most of the employees picked at their food, talking quietly, glancing around as though they all sensed the uneasy shift. Laura noticed Alex sitting alone at the far end of the table, her eyes downcast as she sipped her coffee. Henry, meanwhile, was his usual self, breezy and confident, cracking jokes and trying to lighten the mood. But there was a forced quality to his laughter, a tightness in his smile that Laura had never seen before. Laura decided to step out for some fresh air, hoping a quiet walk around the lake would clear her mind. As she wandered along the water's edge, she heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Sarah catching up with her. "You noticed it too, didn't you?" Sarah asked without preamble, her expression serious. Laura nodded, understanding immediately what Sarah was referring to. They'd both seen Henry's persistent attention toward Alex the night before, and both of them sensed something was deeply wrong. "Do you think something happened between them?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah hesitated, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was nearby before answering. "I don't know, but I don't like the way he's been acting. It's like he's obsessed, and Alex seems terrified." Laura swallowed, feeling a chill creep over her despite the mild morning air. Sarah's words echoed her own thoughts she hadn't wanted to confront. Henry had always been charming, professional, even charismatic. But this fixation on Alex was unsettling, to say the least. They continued their walk in silence, each lost in their thoughts. When they returned to the cottage, they found the rest of the group preparing for a team-building activity on the lake. Henry had organized a kayaking race, and the employees were beginning to relax as they set up the equipment and split into teams. Laura noticed that Alex had been paired with Henry, who seemed all too pleased with the arrangement. The look on Alex's face was unmistakable, a mixture of dread and resignation. She caught Laura's gaze for a brief moment, her eyes pleading, as if silently asking for help. As the race began, the employees paddled out onto the lake, their laughter and shouts echoing over the water. Laura stayed on the shore, her eyes glued to Henry and Alex's kayak as it drifted away from the others, moving further and further toward the secluded end of the lake. A knot of anxiety twisted in her stomach as she watched them disappear around a bend, hidden by the thick trees lining the shore. She knew she should say something, do something, but she felt paralyzed, caught between her loyalty to her boss and her growing sense of unease. After what felt like an eternity, the other teams returned, laughing and joking as they pulled their kayaks up onto the shore. But there was no sign of Henry and Alex. Laura's heart began to pound as the minutes ticked by. She exchanged a worried glance with Sarah, who looked equally concerned. Just as Laura was about to call out for them, Henry emerged from the trees, alone, his expression dark and unreadable. He walked straight past them without a word, heading back to the cottage with quick, angry strides. Laura felt her blood run cold. "Where's Alex?" she asked, her voice sharp with alarm. Henry didn't respond, didn't even look back. She turned to Sarah, panic flaring in her chest. Without another thought, the two of them ran along the edge of the lake, calling out for Alex. After several agonizing minutes, they found her sitting on a rock near the water's edge, her head in her hands. She looked up as they approached, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed. "What happened?" Laura asked, kneeling beside her. Alex hesitated, glancing around to make sure they were alone. He told me to keep quiet," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He said if I tell anyone about what's been happening, he'll make sure I lose my job." Laura felt a surge of anger rise within her. She'd suspected that something was wrong, but hearing the confirmation filled her with a fierce protectiveness. Alex was just a young woman trying to build her career, and Henry had taken advantage of his position to intimidate her. Sarah reached out, putting a comforting hand on Alex's shoulder. "We're not going to let him get away with this," she said firmly. "You're not alone in this." Alex nodded, though her expression remained fearful. It was clear that she didn't fully believe them, that she felt trapped and powerless. Laura exchanged a determined look with Sarah. They had to do something, but the question was, what? As the group gathered for lunch, the atmosphere was tense. Henry kept his distance from Alex, who sat silently between Laura and Sarah, her gaze fixed on her plate. Laura noticed how the other employees were watching them, their expressions curious, perhaps sensing the rift but unsure of the cause. Henry, for his part, maintained his usual charm, laughing and joking as though nothing was wrong. But every now and then, his eyes would flicker toward Alex, a hard, calculating look that made Laura's skin crawl. After lunch, Laura pulled Sarah aside. "We have to tell someone. Maybe go to the board of directors, or at least someone in HR back at the office," she said in a low voice. Sarah nodded, but her expression was doubtful. "Do you think they'll believe us? Henry's the CEO. He has influence, power. He could make this go away with a single phone call." Laura knew she was right, but the thought of staying silent felt unbearable. Alex didn't deserve this, and neither did anyone else who might come after her. As evening fell, the group gathered around the bonfire once more, though the mood was somber. Laura noticed that Henry kept to himself, nursing a drink as he stared into the flames, his expression distant and brooding. She wondered if he knew they were onto him, if he sensed the growing tension among his employees. Sarah and Laura kept close to Alex, creating a silent barrier between her and Henry. Just when Laura thought the night would pass quietly, Henry suddenly stood up, his gaze fixed on Alex. "We need to talk," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Alex froze, her face pale, but before she could respond, Sarah stepped in. "I don't think she wants to talk to you, Henry," she said, her voice steady. Henry's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with anger as he looked from Sarah to Laura, who nodded in silent support. "What's going on here?" another employee, Mark, asked, sensing the tension. Henry forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "Nothing, just a misunderstanding," he said, but the strain in his voice was evident. Mark looked unconvinced, and soon others were watching, curiosity and concern written on their faces. The situation was spiraling, and Laura knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Henry's facade finally cracked. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He glanced around, realizing he was losing control of the narrative. In that moment, Laura saw something shift in his eyes. A flicker of desperation, a hint of fear, and that's when it hit her. Henry wasn't just concerned about his reputation. He was hiding something much bigger than anyone had realized. As the fire crackled and the shadows danced, Laura felt a chill wash over her. She had a feeling that they were only scratching the surface, that there was more to Henry's story than met the eye. The following morning, the tension in the cottage was like a tangible weight pressing down on everyone. The previous night's confrontation had left an invisible rift between Henry and the rest of the group. He seemed to sense it too, his usual confidence replaced with a guarded defensiveness. Henry moved around the breakfast table with a stiff formality, avoiding eye contact with anyone who might challenge him. It was clear that the previous night had shifted something fundamental within the group, and Henry was no longer the unchallenged authority he had been when they'd arrived. As everyone sat eating in uneasy silence, Laura's mind raced. She couldn't shake the thought that they were missing something important. Henry's reaction last night had been more than just anger, it had been fear. She'd caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, a look of desperation she hadn't seen before. It was as if he was concealing something far more sinister, something that went beyond his inappropriate behavior toward Alex. It left her both unsettled and deeply curious. After breakfast, the team gathered for a planned hike up a nearby trail. The path wound through dense woods, climbing steadily upward until it reached a rocky outcrop that overlooked the lake. It was supposed to be a bonding activity, but with the group fractured by suspicion, the hike only served to amplify the underlying tension. Henry lagged behind, his gaze fixed on the trail, seemingly lost in thought. Laura stayed close to Alex, while Sarah and Mark exchanged meaningful glances, both of them clearly still rattled by the events of the night before. As they reached the top of the trail, Henry finally broke the silence. "Look, everyone, I know things got a little tense last night. I think we should clear the air," he said, his tone smooth and practiced, but there was a hardness in his eyes that betrayed his frustration. He scanned the faces around him, as if daring anyone to challenge him. "Whatever you think you know, you're wrong," he continued, his gaze resting on Alex for a fraction too long. "This was supposed to be a weekend to bring us closer together, but it feels like some people are more interested in creating drama." Laura felt her anger flare. It was infuriating to see him twist the situation, as though they were the ones causing problems. She opened her mouth to respond, but Sarah beat her to it. "Henry, no one's creating drama. People are just uncomfortable with certain things," she said carefully, her voice steady but her eyes fierce. Henry's face darkened, and for a moment, Laura thought he might lose his composure. "Uncomfortable," Henry repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. He took a step closer to Sarah, his posture menacing. "Let me be very clear. There's nothing going on here that warrants this kind of reaction. You're all acting like children, blowing things out of proportion." His eyes darted toward Alex, his gaze hardening. "And some of you should think very carefully before spreading lies that could damage someone's career." Alex shrank back, visibly shaken by the thinly veiled threat. Laura's protective instincts kicked in, and she took a step forward, placing herself between Alex and Henry. "No one's spreading lies, Henry. But maybe if you acted more professionally, people wouldn't feel uncomfortable," she said, her voice firm. The tension between them crackled like static, and for a moment, it seemed like things might escalate even further. Then, out of nowhere, Mark cleared his throat. "Actually, Henry, I think we all deserve to know what's really going on," he said, his tone even but resolute. "I think you owe us an explanation." His words hung in the air, and everyone turned to look at him. Surprise and curiosity etched on their faces. Henry's expression shifted, a flicker of something almost like panic crossing his face, before he quickly masked it. "There's nothing to explain," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I've told you all that this is a misunderstanding." But Mark didn't back down. "Then why did I overhear you on the phone last night?" he asked, his voice calm but insistent. "I didn't hear everything, but it sounded like you were talking about a payout, something you didn't want getting out. Care to explain that?" A heavy silence settled over the group as Henry leaned forward, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. He looked different, as though the weight of his secrets had physically drained him. His hands trembled slightly as he ran them through his hair, and for a moment he seemed to be wrestling with himself, debating how much to reveal. The other employees exchanged uneasy glances, sensing they were on the brink of uncovering something far darker than they had anticipated. "All right," he began, his voice low and hollow. "I never wanted it to come to this. I've been with this company since its early days. I built it from the ground up, sacrificed everything, and made it what it is today." His gaze swept over the group, lingering on each face as if searching for some semblance of understanding. But sometimes, in business, things get complicated. Laura felt a shiver run down her spine. She had heard that phrase too many times, a common refrain among executives who had crossed ethical lines and attempted to justify their actions. She could sense that Henry was trying to prepare them, soften the impact of whatever he was about to admit. But there was no mistaking the apprehension in his eyes, the slight quiver in his voice as he continued. "About 2 years ago, we were on the verge of bankruptcy," he confessed. "I was desperate. I needed capital fast. And so I started looking for investors, anyone who could help us stay afloat. That's when I met Robert Page." He paused, and a collective murmur went through the group. They all knew the name. Robert Page was a shadowy figure, rumored to have connections in some questionable circles. He was known for his vast fortune, but his reputation was tainted by rumors of underhanded deals and offshore accounts. Laura exchanged a glance with Sarah and Mark, both of whom looked as disturbed as she felt. This was bigger than any of them had realized. "I made a deal with him," Henry continued, his gaze fixed on the flames. "It was supposed to be simple. He'd provide the funds, and I'd pay him back within 2 years, with a significant interest. But as time went on, I realized it wasn't going to be that easy." His voice wavered, and Laura could see the toll this was taking on him. She almost felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly overshadowed by anger. He had put the entire company at risk, involved them with a man who was known for his unethical practices, all in the name of saving his own skin. And now, it seemed, they were all paying the price. "The money helped us stay afloat, but it came with strings attached," Henry admitted. "Robert wanted more than just interest payments. He wanted control. He started making demands, insisting that I put certain people on the payroll, approve certain deals. And when I pushed back, he threatened me." The words hung in the air, and a chill crept over the group. They were all beginning to understand the scope of Henry's situation, the extent of the web he had entangled them in. But as shocking as it was, Laura could tell there was still more, something he was holding back. "What does this have to do with Alex?" Sarah finally asked, her tone steely. Henry flinched, as if struck by the question. His eyes flickered toward Alex, who was sitting stiffly, her face pale. For a moment, Laura thought he might deny any connection, but then he sighed heavily, as if resigning himself to the truth. "When Alex joined the company, Robert saw her as an opportunity," Henry admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. He wanted information. Inside information, things that could be valuable to him. He thought he could use her to gain leverage, and when I refused, he threatened to destroy everything I'd worked for. I tried to keep her out of it, but Robert has eyes everywhere. I started receiving messages, instructions on how to keep Alex close, How to manipulate her. Alex's face crumpled, and Laura's heart ached for her. The realization of how she had been used, exploited, and placed in harm's way without her knowledge was a devastating blow. The rest of the group sat in stunned silence, each grappling with the implications of Henry's confession. It was clear now that this wasn't just about inappropriate advances or secret dealings. This was something far more sinister, a manipulation of the very people who had trusted him. "So you used her?" Mark's voice was filled with disgust. "You put her at risk, all because you didn't want to lose your company." Henry's face twisted in anguish, and he clenched his fists. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," he insisted, desperation lacing his words. "I thought I could control it, that I could keep her safe. But Robert, he doesn't play by any rules. He saw my hesitation as a weakness, and he started pushing harder. That's when I started to notice things going missing. Files, documents. I had no choice." Laura's mind reeled as she pieced together the implications of his confession. Henry hadn't just betrayed Alex, he had betrayed all of them, dragging the entire company into a tangled web of deceit and corruption. The group was silent, each of them struggling to process the enormity of what they'd just learned. But Henry wasn't finished. His gaze dropped to the ground, his shoulders slumping as though he were finally defeated. "And then, when I realized Alex had found that file, the confidential file, I panicked. I knew Robert would find out. I had to do something, anything, to keep her quiet. That's when I started making threats. Idle threats, I told myself, just enough to keep her from talking. But I never meant to hurt her. I didn't know what else to do." A wave of disgust washed over Laura as she listened to him try to justify his actions. It was sickening, the way he spoke, as though his desperation excused his behavior, as though the fear of losing his company somehow justified the betrayal of the people who had trusted him. She glanced at Alex, whose face was expressionless, her eyes vacant. It was as if she had detached herself from the horror of what she was hearing, too numb to process the reality of the situation. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Finally, Sarah broke it. "So what now?" she asked, her tone cold and unforgiving. "You think you can just sweep this under the rug? That we'll all go back to the office on Monday and pretend nothing happened?" Henry's face contorted with anger, but he didn't respond. Instead, he simply turned away, his gaze fixed on the dark expanse of the lake. Laura could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that he had lost control, that the truth he had worked so hard to conceal was finally out in the open. She could almost feel the weight of his secrets pressing down on him, crushing him under their enormity. Without a word, he stood up and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. The group sat in silence, each of them lost in their thoughts, grappling with the implications of what they had just learned. They had come to this cottage as a team, bound by loyalty and camaraderie, but now they were fractured, each of them burdened with the knowledge of Henry's betrayal. Laura looked around at the faces of her colleagues, each of them reflecting the same mixture of shock, anger, and betrayal that she felt. It was clear that things could never go back to the way they had been, that this weekend had changed everything. And as she watched the flickering flames of the bonfire, she couldn't help but wonder what the future held for all of them. In the distance, a faint rustling broke the silence, and they all turned to see Henry standing at the edge of the woods, his face shadowed and unreadable. He looked back at them for a long moment, a look of regret in his eyes, before he turned and vanished into the trees, leaving them alone with the weight of his secrets and the shattered remnants of their trust. The following day arrived with a bitter chill, though it was late spring. The unease and shattered trust from the night before lingered heavily over the group. No one spoke much as they moved about the cottage, each employee lost in their thoughts, processing the revelations that had come spilling out by the fire. The atmosphere, once charged with anticipation of bonding and relaxation, now felt haunted by betrayal and guilt. Henry's confession had fractured their perceptions of him, of the company, and even of each other. For Laura, the devastation was more profound than she'd anticipated. This place, meant to be a sanctuary, was now a theater for their collective disillusionment. As they gathered in the kitchen for breakfast, the silence was oppressive. Sarah made a half-hearted attempt to break the ice, but the few words she spoke quickly died in the thick air, echoing hollowly around them. Alex sat at the corner of the table, quiet and pale, her face etched with exhaustion. Laura watched her, a wave of empathy and protectiveness washing over her. Alex had been the unwilling target of Henry's desperate manipulations, drawn into a world of deceit she hadn't asked for. And now, she seemed like a shadow of herself, withdrawn and closed off. Laura cleared her throat, feeling the need to say something, anything, to pierce the suffocating silence. "I think we should talk about this," she began, her voice soft but steady. "We can't just pretend none of it happened." Her words seemed to hang in the air, met with a few hesitant nods. Mark looked down at his coffee, swirling it absently, as though reluctant to meet anyone's gaze. Henry crossed lines, serious ones. Sarah agreed, her tone hardened by anger and disappointment. "We trusted him, believed in him. And he's been manipulating us this whole time. He used Alex, he risked the company, and now he's acting like it's something we should just ignore." She shook her head, her hands clenched into fists. "I don't think I can walk back into that office and just pretend everything's okay. I don't think any of us can," Mark added, finally lifting his eyes. "But what do we do about it? He's still the CEO. He has power, connections. If we go to the board, what's stopping him from twisting the story, from making us out to be the villains?" His words rang with a painful truth. They were all painfully aware of the risks involved in challenging Henry, of the power imbalance that tilted the scales heavily in his favor. Laura looked around the table, searching the faces of her colleagues. She saw fear, uncertainty, anger, all mirrored in her own heart. But then her gaze landed on Alex, who looked up with a glint of something unexpected in her eyes. Defiance. Despite the vulnerability that had defined her since Henry's confession, there was a newfound determination in her expression, a fire that hadn't been there before. "Maybe we don't need to go to the board," Alex said quietly, her voice carrying an edge of steel. "Maybe we go public. This isn't just about protecting our jobs anymore. Henry has put everyone at risk, and he can't be allowed to get away with it." The room fell silent as her words sank in, each of them considering the gravity of her proposal. To take the story public meant exposing themselves, risking not only their careers but their reputations, and possibly their futures. It was a bold move, a dangerous one. But as Laura looked at Alex, she realized it was also the only choice that felt right. "I'm with Alex," Laura said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "If we keep this in-house, Henry has the power to cover it up, to twist things in his favor. But if we go public, we're shining a light on the truth. He can't control that." She looked around the table, meeting each gaze with a resolve that had crystallized overnight. "It's risky, yes, but it's the only way to make sure he faces the consequences of his actions." One by one, her colleagues nodded, the fear in their eyes gradually giving way to a sense of purpose. They knew it wouldn't be easy, that they were about to embark on a path fraught with challenges and potential backlash. But the sense of unity that had once bound them was returning, forged anew in the shared determination to do what was right, no matter the cost. The rest of the day passed in a tense flurry of whispered conversations and strategizing. They decided to draft a collective statement, detailing Henry's actions and the risks he had imposed on the company and its employees. Each of them contributed their perspectives, their experiences, building a narrative that was both damning and undeniable. They knew they needed more than words, though, and Alex, recalling her discovery of the confidential file on Henry's computer, volunteered to try to retrieve it as evidence. It was a dangerous move, but Alex seemed undeterred, her newfound resolve propelling her forward. As night fell, they gathered once more around the bonfire, their gazes flickering between the flames and the dark woods beyond. where Henry had disappeared the night before. They knew he would return eventually. He was too invested in his power to simply walk away. But they were ready for him. Laura's heart pounded as she thought about the confrontation that lay ahead, the final reckoning they were preparing to deliver. Just as they settled into an uneasy silence, a rustling in the bushes signaled Henry's return. He emerged from the shadows, his face drawn and haggard, his usual confidence eroded by the weight of his secrets and the realization that he was no longer in control. He glanced around at them, his gaze wary, and Laura could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. He sensed the change, the unity that had formed among them in his absence. "Back from your stroll." Mark's voice was laced with a cold sarcasm that surprised even him. Henry bristled, his eyes narrowing as he looked between each of them, clearly aware that something had shifted. He opened his mouth to respond, but Laura cut him off, her voice calm yet unwavering. "We know, Henry," she said simply. "We know everything." The words seemed to hang in the air, and Henry's face drained of color as he realized the extent of their knowledge. He took a step back, his gaze darting between them as though searching for an escape. "Know what exactly?" he asked, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow, desperate. "You're all overreacting. Whatever you think you know, it's not what it seems." "Don't insult us, Henry," Alex said, stepping forward. Her voice was steady, her eyes filled with a fierce resolve that took even Henry by surprise. "We know about the offshore accounts, the deals with Robert Page. We know you've been manipulating us, using us to cover your tracks, and we know you tried to silence me." Henry's composure faltered, his mask slipping as panic flashed across his face. He looked around, as though hoping to find someone who would come to his defense, but the silence that met him was absolute. He was alone, his power over them shattered. "Fine," he spat, his voice laced with bitterness. "Yes, I made some deals. I did what I had to do to keep this company alive. If any of you had been in my position, you would have done the same." He glared at them, his expression a twisted mixture of anger and resentment. "But you're all too naive to understand that. You think you're so righteous, so morally superior. But in the real world, sacrifices have to be made. I did what was necessary." "No, you did what was selfish," Laura countered, her voice sharp and unyielding. "You put all of us at risk for your own gain, and now you want to justify it, as if we should be grateful. You exploited Alex, intimidated us, and now you expect us to look the other way. That's not leadership, Henry. That's cowardice." Henry's face contorted with rage, but he had no rebuttal, no defense. He looked at them, each of them standing firm, unyielding in their determination to hold him accountable. For the first time, Laura saw fear in his eyes, the realization that he was truly alone. The silence stretched on, heavy and charged, until finally Henry turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. The group watched him go, the weight of their decisions settling over them. They knew that this was only the beginning, that the path they had chosen would be fraught with challenges. But they also knew that they had done the right thing, that they had reclaimed their integrity, their voices, and their power. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, Laura felt a sense of closure, a quiet certainty that they had done the only thing they could have done. Together, they had faced the darkness, exposed the truth, and taken a stand. The final day of the retreat dawned under a bleak sky, gray clouds hanging low over the lake, as if reflecting the collective weight that had settled upon the team. None of them had slept well after the confrontation with Henry, their minds racing with the implications of what lay ahead. They had chosen the hard path, one of truth and accountability, but the challenges that awaited them were daunting. For Laura, it was the first morning in which she felt the full weight of what they had committed to. They had stripped away the illusion, unraveled the carefully constructed facade of a leader they'd once respected, and exposed the rot beneath. The consequences of their choice hung over them like the storm that had threatened to break all weekend. They sat around the kitchen table, sharing a quiet, almost solemn breakfast. There was a sense of solidarity among them now, a shared understanding that had deepened overnight. Alex sat between Laura and Sarah, looking more grounded, less haunted, though there was still a lingering shadow in her eyes. Her ordeal was far from over, but the fire of defiance from the previous night had not dimmed. If anything, it had strengthened. Laura caught her eye and offered a small nod of encouragement, a silent affirmation that they would see this through together. "I've been thinking about what we'd do next," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "If we're really going public, we'll need a plan. Something that ensures we're protected and that the truth doesn't get buried by Henry's connections." Her words hung in the air, and everyone nodded in agreement. They were united, but they were also aware of the power Henry wielded. A public accusation was risky, and they knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. Laura took a deep breath, her voice steady as she spoke. "I think we should gather all the evidence we can, but we need to make sure we don't do it alone. There are journalists who specialize in uncovering corporate misconduct, people who can amplify our story. If we bring it to the right outlet, we'll have a better chance of making sure it doesn't get swept under the rug." "I know someone." Mark chimed in unexpectedly, his face thoughtful. "A former classmate who works as an investigative reporter. He's tackled stories like this before, stories involving corporate corruption. He has a reputation for protecting his sources, for getting the truth out there, no matter who tries to stop him." Laura felt a surge of hope. They had a plan now, a tangible path forward. With the right journalist, their story could reach the public unfiltered, unedited by anyone who might try to defend Henry's actions. They would be protected by transparency, by the sheer power of exposing the truth in a way that no one could ignore. They spent the morning gathering their thoughts, organizing their story, and piecing together the chain of events that had led them to this point. Alex shared the details of her experiences, the threats Henry had made, the confidential files she had glimpsed, but never dared open. Sarah compiled their collective memories, the moments they'd each witnessed that painted a clear picture of Henry's coercion and manipulation. They created a timeline, each contribution adding weight and context to their story, transforming it into a damning narrative that would be impossible for Henry to refute. By midday, they were ready. Mark made the call to his journalist friend, Jacob, who agreed to meet them in a quiet corner of a nearby town to discuss the details. As they packed up their things, a sense of anticipation mixed with anxiety filled the cottage. They were about to step into uncharted territory, a space where the stakes were high and the consequences unpredictable. The drive to the meeting point was quiet, each person lost in their thoughts. Laura's mind buzzed with a mixture of apprehension and relief. This was the moment they had committed to, the final step in taking down Henry's empire of lies. She glanced over at Alex, who was staring out the window, her jaw set with determination. For Alex, this wasn't just about exposing Henry, it was about reclaiming her own sense of safety, about ensuring that no one else would be victimized as she had been. When they arrived at the small cafe where Jacob was waiting, they were greeted by a man with a kind but serious expression, his eyes sharp with a keen intelligence that took in each of them with a measured gaze. He gestured them to a private booth at the back of the cafe, away from any curious eyes or ears. "I want you all to know," Jacob began, leaning forward, "that what you're doing isn't easy. Going up against someone with power and connections comes with risks. But I've done this before, and I know how to protect my sources. Your safety is my priority, and I'll make sure your story reaches the people who need to hear it." His voice was calm, reassuring, and Laura felt a wave of relief wash over her. One by one, they each recounted their experiences, laying out the details of Henry's actions. Jacob listened intently, taking notes, his face expressionless as he absorbed the weight of their words. Occasionally, he would nod, his eyes flickering with something close to anger as he heard the lengths Henry had gone to in order to maintain his control. By the time they finished, Jacob looked up, his face solemn. "This story is going to cause waves," he said, Henry won't be able to escape this, not with the evidence you've provided. I'll make sure it's airtight, that no one can poke holes in it or twist the narrative in his favor. But you need to be prepared. Once this goes public, it's going to change everything." Laura nodded, feeling the full weight of his words. She knew this wasn't just about bringing Henry to justice. It was about changing the very foundation of the company they had all built together, about redefining the culture and values they stood for. It was daunting, terrifying even, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time, she felt a sense of true purpose, a conviction that had been missing from her work for far too long. As they left the cafe, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the town. It felt symbolic, as though they had finally emerged from the darkness that had overshadowed them all weekend. They knew there would be challenges ahead, but they also knew that they were stronger now, united in a way they had never been before. In the days that followed, Jacob worked tirelessly to verify their story, gathering additional sources and cross-referencing every detail. The group stayed in contact, supporting each other as they waited for the article to be published. Alex, in particular, struggled with the emotional toll, the memories of Henry's threats and manipulation still fresh in her mind. But with Laura and the others by her side, she found the strength to push forward, to reclaim her voice and her sense of self. When the story finally broke, it was a firestorm. Headlines blazed across news outlets, social media lit up with outrage, and Henry's carefully curated image unraveled in real time. The public response was swift and unforgiving, with calls for accountability echoing from every corner. People who had once respected him turned their backs, denouncing his actions, and board members within the company called for an immediate investigation. Within days, Henry was forced to resign, his empire crumbling under the weight of the truth. The company initiated sweeping changes, implementing policies to protect employees and foster a culture of transparency and respect. Laura was offered a prominent role in the restructuring efforts, a chance to rebuild the company from within. And she accepted, determined to create a workplace where no one would ever have to endure what Alex had. The community, once shaken by the scandal, rallied behind Laura, Alex, and the others, hailing them as champions of integrity and justice. Their story became a powerful example of courage, a reminder that even the most formidable figures could be held accountable when people stood together. They had faced down a seemingly insurmountable force, and in doing so, they had reclaimed not only their own sense of dignity, but also the company's values. In the months that followed, Alex blossomed, her confidence returning as she saw the ripple effect of their actions. She became an advocate for workplace rights, speaking openly about her experience, determined to help others who found themselves in similar situations. Laura watched with pride as Alex found her voice, her resilience and strength a testament to the power of standing up for what was right. One evening, as they celebrated the company's reformation with a quiet gathering, Laura looked around at her colleagues, a profound sense of gratitude filling her heart. They had weathered the storm together, faced down their fears, and emerged stronger on the other side. She knew they would always carry the scars of what they'd been through, but those scars were a reminder of their courage, of the unbreakable bond they had forged. As the night wore on, Laura found herself reflecting on the journey they had taken, the transformation that had occurred not only within the company but within each of them. They had confronted the darkness, exposed the lies, and built something new in its place, a legacy of truth and accountability that would endure for years to come. In a quiet moment, she raised her glass, her voice steady as she spoke. "To all of us," she said, looking around at the faces of her friends, her comrades. "To the truth, to resilience, and to the strength we found in each other." And as their glasses clinked, a sense of peace settled over Laura, a quiet certainty that they had done something extraordinary, something that would leave a lasting impact not only on their lives, but on the lives of countless others. They had made a difference, and as they looked toward the future, they knew they would face it together, stronger and more united than ever before.